create timeline animations. Create timeline animations. Note here please now. For Photoshop versions earlier than Photoshop CC, some functionality discussed in this article may be available, by the way, only if you have Photoshop Extended, and Photoshop doesn't have a separate Extend offering, and all features, by the way, in Photoshop Extended are part of Photoshop. So what about timeline animation workflow? Timeline animation workflow. To animate layer content in timeline mode. By the way, you can set keyframes in the timeline panel, and as you move the current time indicator to a different time or frame, and then modify the position and opacity or style of the layer content, and Photoshop automatically adds or modifies a series of frames between two existing frames, and varying the layer properties and the position and opacity and the stylus, and evenly between the new frames to create the appearance of movement of transformation. For example, if you want to fade out a layer, set the opacity of the layer in the starting frame to 100% and click the opacity stopwatch for the layer, and then move the current time indicator to the time and frame for the ending frame, and set the opacity for the same layer to 0%, and Photoshop automatically interpolates frame between the start and end frames, and the opacity of the layer is reduced evenly across the new frames. And in addition to letting Photoshop interpolate frames in an animation, you can also create a hand-drawn, frame by frame, by the way, animation by painting on a blank video layer. And if you want to create a SWF format animation, you can't use Adobe Flash or Adobe After Effects or Adobe Illustrator, by the way. And to create a timeline-based animation, you can use also the following general workflow. Number 1, you can create a new document. Create new document, specify the size and background content, and make sure the pixel aspect ratio and dimensions are appropriate for the output of your animation. And the color mode should be RGB, unless you have special reasons for making changes. Leave the resolution at 72 pixels or inch, and the bit depth at 8 ppi, and the pixel aspect ratio at square. And make sure the timeline panel is open, and if necessary, click the down pointing arrow in the middle of the panel, and then choose Create Video Timeline from the menu, and then click the button to the left of the arrow. And in the timeline, if the timeline panel is in frame animation mode, you should click the Convert to Video Timeline icon in the lower left corner of the panel. And number 2, specify the set timeline frame rate in the panel menu. Specify the duration and frame rate. You have to see. Specify timeline duration and frame rate. Step number 3, add a layer. How to add a layer? By the way, background layers can't be animated, by the way, if you want to animate content, and either convert the background layer to a normal layer or add any of the following. A new layer for adding content, and a new video layer for adding video content, and a new blank video layer for cloning content to or creating hand-drawn animations. Step number 4, add content to the layer. Add content to the layer. Step number 5, optional, add a layer mask. By the way, a layer mask can be used to reveal a portion of the layer's content, and you can animate the layer mask to reveal different portions of the layer's content over time. And you have to see add layer masks. Step number 6, move the current time indicator to the time or frame where you want to set the first keyframe. And you have to use keyframes to animate layer properties. Step number 7, turn on keyframing for a layer property. You should click the triangle next to the layer name, and a down pointing triangle displays the layer's properties, by the way, and then click the stopwatch to set the first keyframe for the layer property you want to animate. And you can set keyframes also for more than one layer property at a time, by the way. Step number 8, move the current time indicator and change a layer property. By the way, you can't move the current time indicator to the time or frame where the layer's property changes, and you can do one of the or more of the following. Change the position of the layer to make layer content move. After that, change layer opacity to make content fade in or out. After that, change the position of a layer mask to reveal different parts of the layer. After that, turn a layer mask on or off. And for some types of animation, such as changing the color of an object, or completely changing the content in a frame, you need additional layers with the new content. Note and be careful please here now. To animate shapes, you animate the vector mask rather than the shape layer, and using the time vary stopwatch for vector mask position or vector mask enable. Step number 9. Add additional layers with content and edit their layers properties as needed. Step number 10. Move or trim the layer duration bar to specify when a layer appears in an animation. And you have to set the timeline area to preview. Step number 11. Preview the animation. You can use the controls in the timeline panel to play the animation as you create it, and then preview the animation in your web browser, and you can also preview the animation in the Save for Web dialog box. And you have to see previewing video or timeline animations. Step number 12. Save the animation. By the way, you can save the animation as an animated GIF using the Save for Web command, or as an image sequence or video using the Render video command, and you can also save it in BSD format, which can be imported into Adobe After Effects. How to use keyframes to animate layer properties. How to use keyframes to animate layer properties. By the way, you can animate different layer properties such as position and opacity and style, and each change can occur independently of or simultaneously with other changes. And if you want to animate different objects independently, it's best to create, by the way, them on separate layers. And here are some examples of how you can animate layer properties. By the way, you can animate position by adding a keyframe to the position property, and then moving the current time indicator and dragging the layer in the document window. And after that, you can animate a layer's opacity by adding a keyframe to the opacity property, and then moving the current time indicator and changing the layer's opacity in the layers panel. After that, you can animate 3D properties such as object and camera position. For more information, see create 3D animations. And to animate a property using keyframes, you must set at least two keyframes for that property. Otherwise, changes that you make to the layer's property remain in effect for the duration of the layer. And each layer, by the way, property has a time vary, a stopwatch icon that you click to begin animating, and when your stopwatch is active for a specific property, Photoshop, by the way, automatically sets new keyframes whenever you change the current time and the property value. And when the stopwatch is inactive for a property, the property has no keyframes, by the way. And if you type a value for a layer property while the stopwatch is inactive, the value remains, by the way, in effect for the duration of the layer. And if you deselect the stopwatch, you will permanently delete all of the keyframes of that property. How to choose interpolation method. Interpolation method, by the way, sometimes called twinning, and describes the process of filing in unknown values between two known values and in digital video and film. Interpolation usually means generating new values between two keyframes, by the way. And for example, to move a graphic element 50 pixels to the left in 15 frames, you would set the position of the graphic in the first and 15 frames and mark them both as keyframes. And Photoshop interpolates the frames between the two keyframes. Interpolation between keyframes can be used, by the way, to animate movement and opacity and styles and global lighting. And in the timeline panel, the appearance of a keyframe depends on the interpolation method you choose for the interval between keyframes. And what about linear keyframe? Linear keyframe is meaning evenly. It changes the animated property from one keyframe to another. And the one exception is the layer mask position property, which switches between enabled and disabled states abruptly. And what about hold keyframe? Hold keyframe is meaning that maintains the current property setting, and this interpolation, by the way, is useful for strop effects or when you want layers to appear or disappear suddenly. And to choose the interpolation method for a keyframe, do one of the following. We have two steps. Step number 1. In the timeline panel, you should select one or more keyframes. Step number 2. Right click a selected keyframe and then choose either a linear interpolation or halt interpolation from the context menu. After that, open the panel menu again and choose either keyframe interpolation, then select linear or keyframe interpolation, then select halt. Choose halt. How to move the current time indicator to a keyframe. How to move the current time indicator to a keyframe. By the way, after you set the initial keyframe for a property, Photoshop by the way displays the keyframe navigator, which you can use to move from keyframe to keyframe or to set or remove keyframes. And when the keyframe navigator demount is active yellow, the current time indicator by the way lies precisely at a keyframe for that layer property. And when the keyframe navigator demount is inactive gray, the current time by the way indicator lies between keyframes. And when arrows appear on each side of the keyframe navigator box, other keyframes by the way for that property exist on both sides of the current time. And in the timeline panel, you should click a keyframe navigator arrow, and this arrow to the left moves the current time indicator to the previous keyframes, and the arrow to the right moves the current time indicator by the way to the next keyframe. How to select keyframes? If you'd like to select the keyframes, what should you do? In the timeline panel, do any of the following to select keyframes. To select a keyframe, you should click the keyframe icon firstly. After that, to select multiple keyframes, you should shift click the keyframes or drag a selection marquee around the keyframes. After that, to select all keyframes for a layer property, you should click the layer property name next to the stopwatch icon. How to move keyframes? How to move the keyframes? We have two steps. Number 1, if you'd like to move keyframes, in the timeline panel, you should select one or more keyframes. After that, step number 2, drag any of the selected keyframes icons to the desired time. And if you selected multiple keyframes, they move as a group and maintain the same time spacing. To expand or compress the spacing of multiple keyframes by the way, Alt drag if you use Windows or Option drag if you use macOS, and as the first or last keyframe in the selection, the keyframe by the way at the opposite end of the selection remains in place as you drag, and slowing down or speeding up the animation. How to copy and paste keyframes. By the way, you can copy keyframes for a property such as position and to the same property in any layer, and when you paste keyframes, they reflect by the way the copied offset from the current time indicator. And you can also copy keyframes from only one layer at a time. And when you paste keyframes by the way into another layer, they appear in the corresponding property in the distillation layer by the way, and the earliest keyframe appears at the current time, and the other keyframes follows in relative order by the way, and the keyframes remain selected after pasting, and so you can immediately move them in the timeline. Note and be careful please here now. You can copy and paste keyframes between more than one property at a time, and you have steps. Step number 1. In the timeline panel, you should display the layer property containing the keyframes you want to copy. Step number 2. Select one or more keyframes. Step number 3. Right click a selected keyframe, then choose copy keyframes. Step number 4. In the timeline panel containing the destination layer, move the current time indicator to the point in time where you want the keyframes to appear. Step number 5. Select the destination layer. Step number 6. Open the panel menu and choose paste keyframes. How to delete keyframes? If you'd like to delete the keyframes, how to delete keyframes? By the way, in the timeline panel, you should select one or more keyframes and do one of the following again, please. Right click Windows. Right click if you use Windows, or control click if you use macOS. And a selected keyframe and choose delete keyframes from the context menu. After that, from the panel menu, you should choose delete keyframes. And how to create hand drawn animations. By the way, you can add a blank video layer to your document when you want to create frame by frame hand drawn animations, and adding a blank video layer above a video layer and then adjusting the opacity of the blank video layer allows you to see the contents of the video layer below. And you can then rotoscope the video layer content by painting or drawing on the blank video layer. And you should to see also bent frames in video layers. Note here please now, if you are animating several independent elements, you can create separate content on different blank video layers. By the way, we have steps. Step number 1, should create a new document firstly. Step number 2, add a blank video layer. Step number 3, paint or add content to the layer. Step number 4, optional. In the timeline panel, you should choose enable onion scans from the panel menu to enable the onion scan mode. Step number 5, move the current time indicator to the next frame. Step number 6, paint or add content to the layer in a slightly different position from the content in the previous frame. And you can add, by the way, you can add a blank video frame, duplicate a frame, or delete a frame from the blank video layer by choosing layers. Then you choose video layers and then choosing the appropriate command. And as you create more hand-drawn frames, you can also either drag the current time indicator, by the way, or use the playback controls to preview your animation. How to insert or delete or duplicate blank video frames. How to insert or delete or duplicate blank video frames. By the way, a blank video frames can be added to or removed from a blank video layer. And you can also duplicate existing painted frames in blank video layers. By the way, we have steps. Step number 1. In the timeline panel, you should select the blank video layer and then move the current time indicator to the desired frame. Step number 2. You should choose layer, then choose video layers, and then choose one of the following. We have options here now. Insert blank frame. Insert blank frame is meaning insert a blank video frame in the selected blank video layer at the current time. And delete frame. Delete frame is meaning deletes the video frames in the selected blank video layer at the current time. And duplicate frame is meaning adds a copy of the video frame at the current time in the selected blank video layer. Specify onion scan setting. Specify onion scan setting. By the way, onion scan mode displays content drawn on the current frame plus content drawn on the surrounding frames, by the way. And these additional frames, by the way, appear at the opacity you specify to distinguish them from the current frame. And the onion scan mode is useful for drawing frame by frame, by the way, animations, because it gives you reference points for stroke positions and other edits. And the onion scan setting specify how previous and later frames appear when onion scans are enabled, by the way. We have steps. Step number 1. Open the timeline panel and choose onion scan setting. And step number 2. Specify options for the following. Onion scan count. Onion scan count is meaning specifies how many previous and forward frames are displayed and enter the frames before previous frames and the frames after forward frames values in the text boxes. And what about frame spacing? Frame spacing is meaning specifies the number of frames between the displayed frames. For example, a value of 1 displays consecutive frames and a value of 2 displays strokes that are 2 frames apart. And the next option, max opacity, is meaning sets the percentage of opacity for the frames immediately before and after the current time. And after that, the next option, min opacity, is meaning sets the percentage of opacity for the last frames of the before and after sets of onion scan frames. After that, the next option, blend mode, is meaning sets the appearance of the areas where the frames overlap. Like the next screenshot now, we have A and B and C images. Onion scanning. These images explain for you onion scanning. A is meaning current frame with 1 frame after. B is meaning current frame with both 1 frame before and after. C is meaning current frame with 1 frame before. So what about open a multi-layer animation? Open a multi-layer animation. By the way, you can open animations that were saved in older versions of Photoshop as multi-layer Photoshop BSD files, and the layers are placed, by the way, in the timeline panel in their stacking order, with the bottom layer becoming the first frame. and you have steps. Step number 1, you have to choose file firstly, then choose open and select the Photoshop file to open. Step number 2, in the layers panel, select the layers you want for the animation. After that, and choose make frames from layers from the panel menu. And you can edit the animation, by the way, and you can use the save for web command to save an animated GIF, or use the render video command to save the animation as a quick time movie.